Hey everybody, how's it going? My name is Royce and welcome into another Pauper video. In today's video, we're not going to be doing gameplay because it's the very end of the year and this is going to be my last video of the year. I thought I would take some time to look forward and to talk about some decks that I'm interested in playing after the new year at some point. Partially this is motivated by the recent lack of any bans in Pauper, with the Pauper format panel announcing that they actually feel that Writhing Chrysalis is a pretty fair mid-range threat. While it's strong in the meta, this is sort of a sign of a healthy meta when you can play a big beefy beater. It provides a good balance of mid-range and aggro and combo. They feel like all the different strategies are fairly well represented, and that while they have their eye on it, for now it seems like Writhing Chrysalis is fine. Some other comments that they've made are that essentially, if Writhing Chrysalis is a problem, we should be playing removal. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about some removal decks that I think can actually hang with Writhing Chrysalis, while also being fairly decent into the field as well. Before I go any further, I just want to express my appreciation really quick for all of your help in getting me to 500 subscribers this year. It was awesome. I never thought I would be in this position, and I'm just going to take all of your kind comments and help to heart and try to keep growing and keep getting better in the next year, so I'm looking forward to that. But let's get into the first deck, and while you would expect that most of these decks would have some representation of black in them, a few of them actually don't, and that's these two blue-red decks that I have my eye on. Now, none of these decks, by the way, are especially new, but I think that they're fairly well positioned at the moment and can definitely hang with the rest of what's going on. Let's actually also move this up to make some more space. There we go. So first of all, we have Blue-Red Terror. For those who are not aware, this is obviously a blue-red deck that aims to control the board through removal like Lightning Bolt and Scred before closing the game out with things like Tolarian Terror, a 1-mana 5/5 with Ward 2, Murmuring Mystic, where whenever you play an instant or sorcery, you make a 1/1 flyer, and Azure Fleet Admiral, which takes the Monarch, and then if the opponent takes it back, you can use the Azure Fleet Admiral to take it back in turn. So we control the board, we try to turn the game around on turn 4 or 5, maybe you play one of these cards with some protection, or you play a Tolarian Terror once your graveyard is full of instants and sorceries, and then you just basically drown your opponent out in card advantage or aggression with the Tolarian Terrors. I've already been putting some work into this deck, trying to practice it. It is actually a lot more complicated than it looks, especially with the early turn sequencing. Getting your multiple colors of mana online efficiently and on time for the interaction that you need to be playing in the first couple of turns, while also shuffling the library at the correct time, is rather difficult, so it takes a lot of thought. I've had some sort of poor performances as I'm practicing, but I'm working up to it to the point where I feel competent enough to make a video with the deck. Another thing about this deck, like I said, is it doesn't have any black in it, but because it plays this 1-mana removal spell, Scred, this can actually destroy Chrysalises a lot of the time. This deck is full of snowlands, and for each snowland you can deal 1 damage to a creature with Scred. Scred is not always enough to kill a Chrysalis, though. If they get a really big one, you're going to be in trouble. So ideally, we try to counter them on the way down, or we only let them through if Scred will actually kill them. One thing I have in mind for this deck, and another blue-red deck that I'm going to show in a second, is maybe playing some number of copies of Boomerang, or Snap, or something like that, to send their Chrysalis back to the hand, and yes, they will get the ETB again and get some more spawns, but perhaps we just need more ways to interact with them once they've actually hit the board, especially if our Scred doesn't do enough to them once they've actually landed. And if we bounce them, then we can counter them on the way back down. That's the logic. So maybe some copies of Snap or Boomerang or some bounce spell would be in order if you're going to be playing a blue deck and you want a good matchup against Chrysalis. Remains to be seen. The other blue-red deck that I'm going to look at is a pretty similar one, but this one uses the Fairy package. We are playing 3 of Fairy Seer and 4 of Spellstutter Sprite, so you can pretty reliably counter some 1 and 2 mana spells, sometimes some spells that cost more than that if you can get a lot of fairies out, but we really are only playing 7. We have a fair few low-to-the-ground creatures in this version of the deck, which is the advantage over Is It Terror. We have the Fairy Seers and Spellstutter Sprites, But we also have the 4 copies of Augur of Bolas, and then we can bounce all of these creatures for repeated value with Ninja of the Deep Hours, draw off of the Ninja, and then counter another thing with the Spellstutter Sprite, scry again with the Fairy Seer, draw another card with Augur of Bolas, etc. It's a similar deck where you aim to win with card advantage, counter a lot of things, remove a lot of things with lightning bolts and screds. It's a little bit different though. We don't have as many top-end threats. Instead, we sort of have this early to mid-game card advantage board control plan, but we still have the 2 of Murmuring Mystic and the 2 of Crimson Fleet Commodore instead of the Azure Fleet Admiral to take the Monarch and try to close the game out and really wrestle it back into our control. Or I guess in this deck, you're not wrestling it back into your control, you're trying to keep the advantage and drive in that final nail on turn 4 or 5. But pretty similar idea. We are playing a single copy of Fire and Ice here, which is interesting. I think you could also play this in Is It Terror. This is pretty nice in the Fairy Mirror matchup. It's also pretty good against Mono Red. Cool modal spell. Now the rest of the decks we're going to be looking at do have black in the colors. So first let's look at Dimir Terror. We were already looking at Is It Terror, but what does Dimir Terror do differently? Well, first off, it is playing hard removal. We're on 4 copies of Snuff Out, but interestingly enough, 0 copies of Cast Down between the main and the sideboard. So that would be something that I would be interested in looking at. Maybe these 4 copies of Snuff Out are enough, but I think a couple copies of Cast Down, especially if we're trying to answer Chrysalis, could be in order. But an interesting thing about this Dimir Terror deck is it's playing all of the graveyard filling, with 4 of Thought Scour and 3 of Mental Note. You don't necessarily always see that. Sometimes Dimir Terror is not trying to turbo out the threats quite as fast as like Mono Blue Terror does, but this deck really seems to be leaning into that. It has all of these 1-mana cantrips, also 3 Ponders, Spell Pierces, Brainstorms, a lot of cheap spells to power out the terrors, and the Gurmag Anglers, while still having some good removal and some good counter spells in the form of Snuff Out. This deck also does have some life gain stabilization with 2 copies of Unexpected Fangs, so it could be pretty nice into Mono Red, and it can afford to run some sweepers as well with Suffocating Fumes and Arms of Hadar in the sideboard. For our next black deck, we have Mono Black Devotion. This is a really old, really popular deck, and when I say popular, I mean amongst the player base. Everybody seems to love this deck, and they see it very affectionately. Basically, the way this deck works is we are only playing black cards. We have sort of a finisher of Grey Merchant of Asphodel, which is 5 mana for a 2/4, where when it enters, for each black pip that you have on the board, you drain 1 life from the opponent. So this is your finisher, and it also provides some nice mid-game stabilization, but the rest of the deck is just card advantage and removal. We have a pile of removal with 4 Defile, which I believe is actually one of the best cards in Pauper. We also have 4 copies of Cast Down, but no copies of Snuff Out in this deck, in the mainer side. I wonder why no Snuff Out here, but only Snuff Outs in Dimir Terror. Pretty interesting. Maybe it's because Snuff Out is free and you want it in the graveyard for the Tolarian Terrors. That's possible. For other removal, we also have the 4 copies of Tithing Blade, and we have some board wipes in the main deck with 3 copies of Crypt Rats. Kumbaj Witches is interesting because this can be used to pick off opposing fairies. This is a very nice main deck in a still pretty fairy-heavy meta, although I think it has calmed down a little bit since a few weeks ago. And then we have some other nice card advantage tools, like Phyrexian Rager to draw a card, and Chittering Rats to make the opponent take a card from their hand and put it back on the top of their deck, which is sometimes even more painful than discarding one of their cards if they're really looking, if they're top decking. Not exactly top decking, but if they really need something in their deck and they don't really care about their hand. So, Mono Black Devotion, traditionally seen as a little bit lower power level, not quite up to snuff with tier 1 or 2 Pauper decks, at least as of recent, but I think it might have a chance to come back if removal really is the game plan, and all the life gain in the deck is handy too against Mono Red. And for the final deck of the video, the principle of this one is if you can't beat them, join them. We're doing Radical Acceptance in this video, and we are playing Writhing Chrysalis ourselves. But that's not all. We're also drawing a million cards with Ichor Wellspring, Lembas, Deadly Dispute, Eviscerator's Insight, and the Monarch emblem from Thorn of the Black Rose, but we're removing the opponent's copies of Writhing Chrysalis, and I guess other cards too. with stuff like Cast Down, Defile, and Snuff Out. Writhing Chrysalis is not our only threat, though. We also have these late-game copies of Troll of Khazad-dûm and Nyxborn Hydra for some awesome surprise trample damage that the opponent will not be expecting sometimes. And we have some nice recursion as well, with this one copy of Pulse of Marasa, which is some nice life gain that can also get back whatever creature you need in the moment. The Witch's Cottage is handy too to bring something back. Now there are multiple Jund lists running around. Ones that you're probably familiar with are Jund Broodscale, as well as this one. Something I've been seeing recently is Jund Affinity, which actually plays black, red, green. Obviously, it drops the blue, so it loses the Thoughtcasts and stuff like that. But you get to play Writhing Chrysalis. You can play Evolution Witness or something like that if you want. I've also seen people play hybrid Broodscale combo and Jund Affinity decks. And I've also seen people play Jund Midrange, which is a deck that Sultan Pauper has had great luck with recently. I know that he's going to be posting a video about that soon. I'll link it down in the comments, or down in the description if it's already been posted. I did give that deck a try myself, and it didn't really play out the way I wanted to. I'll give it another look soon, but I've played a lot of Affinity on this channel. I'm down with playing a deck that has some artifacts, but doesn't lean wholly into the artifact strategy. With that said, thanks so much for watching. That's going to do it. Again, no gameplay in this video, just sort of signing off for the year and wishing you all well and a happy holiday season and saying that I'll see you in 2025 and we're going to have an awesome January. We're going to keep playing Pauper. It's going to be great. We're going to love it. All right. I'll see you later. Remember, if you like this kind of content and want to see more Pauper content just like this, leave a like, comment, and subscription. That would be amazing, and I will see you in the next one.